Rolling?
It's good to have a dog in the shot.
Rolling.
Here we are.
Okay, so today we're doing something quite a bit different. First of all, I've never had this many people in this room before. This is a first.
There you
And
go.
I've got some heavy hitters here to talk about a subject. Now, before we do introductions, I have to say that we're downstairs eating dinner.
Fantastic
Thank
dinner.
you.
Yes. Awesome.
Rhett and
Rhett and
Tilly,
Tilly.
Yes.
made
Good
for
job.
us.
Good job.
And we got into this conversation that we've been having kind of independently of one another for months at this point. And it came up at dinner and we just decided, stop, we have to turn the camera on and film this. But before we get into that, Keith, 5 Watt World, who's coming up on 200,000 subscribers, by the way. So I'll have his channel linked down below.
Not as quickly as I need to.
If you're not subscribed to 5 Watt World, go follow him down there. Dave Honorado, Dojo Guitar Repair. I'll have his Instagram linked down below. And then to complete the three amigos, Rick Beato. So the topic of our argument, discussion,
Both.
Discussion.
Rick incited.
Yeah.
Incited the discussion. Invoked the conversation yet again.
aggressive discussion.
Yeah.
Will vintage electric guitars be worth anything when the older generation, who currently
Basically,
Thank you.
people my age.
Basically,
you guys.
say.
The guy
Yeah.
on this couch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
when the baby boomer generation is gone, our vintage guitar values, specifically bursts, early strats,
really where we were.
things like
Anything
that,
50s, yeah.
are they going to be worth anything?
Right.
No.
Right.
No.
Do you want to get right out front on this?
Oh, I just want to say I don't think that they will. I think that the interest in electric guitar music and groups of that era will be past, and the only people that will be trading these things are people that trade guitars now, that are collectors. If you put a guitar out on Reverb now, a burst, it would sell for a quarter of what it would sell between collectors. Maybe even less than that. And to me, that's the real value of the guitar, is like, what would people pay for it? I mean, a guitar's worth whatever anybody's going to pay for it, but it's like Elvis memorabilia. Once the people are gone that care about that, it's not worth anything.
There's kind of two angles that I tend to come back to on this that make it feel like that might not be true.
Okay.
And those are musicians are still going to be trading these things, and that's one thing. I totally agree with you that musicians might not feel it the same way, but I'm going to come back to that. But collectors always have a vested interest in keeping prices up. So they're always going to be doing everything they can to try to keep the numbers high. And the final thing is, I worked in higher education for 35 years. One of my favorite things to do was to stop and ask a work-study student, what are you listening to? And I got to tell you that it really has never waned in all of those 35 years. The number of people that said Led Zeppelin really never changed. And so if their people are still, watching video of Jimmy Page play, if they're still listening to that music and that's still vital, then I think that actually could continue to influence demand going forward.
Dave?
That's my yes.
My take on it is, if they're not going to be worth any money, then why do we have so many reissues of these guitars? And why do we all own reissues of these guitars? If we didn't care.
But that's the point, though. We own reissues because they're
Yeah, well-
essentially made in a very similar way. Now
No,
you'll say
it's strictly because of money. It's not because if you could buy a real one for the same price as the original, you can tell me to not buy the original.
Right. Well, that's
It's supply and demand, and now what will be waning with these guitars is, yes, your generation who had a real affinity for these guitars because you saw your heroes playing them.
Right.
That will wane
Right.
slightly.
Right.
But they will always be worth the money that they're
I mean,
worth.
who were the
because-
people that bought a lot of these guitars? Paul Allen, people like that are no longer the collectors.
Yeah, high-end
that had,
collectors.
Right.
that had the money to pay for.
Well,
these
we were just down at the table talking about how some of these guitars are so expensive that multiple people own the guitars together.
Right.
Yeah.
They're investment properties.
Which that is becoming more popular in other areas of investment, right? You can buy shares of a home or shares of real estate, for example. And I think we will see that with instruments. To me, when you're talking about a burst Les Paul 58 to 60, you're talking about the electric guitar equivalent of a Stradivarius violin. And if you look at those values of those instruments, they are higher than they've ever been, despite classical music and music that features those instruments not being in the popular public sphere for 70 years, 80
I'm
years,
not sure how much
years?
the prices of those violins have changed over the years. I don't know if they're increasing like they were if you adjust for inflation. I don't think Stradivariuses have become, I might be wrong about that, but I don't think that they've become more valuable.
Well, the interesting
than
thing
they
is,
were.
I'm so over here smirking because I had a conversation with George Gruen when I made my burst video, the history of the burst, 58 to 60. And I called and I got on the phone with George Gruen's a famous vintage dealer. He's been doing it as long as anybody. He made the same argument, but in reverse. He basically said that a burst is just a plank of wood compared to a Martin, a pre-war D45 or a Stradivarius. That was his exact words to me on the telephone. And I said, wait, are you telling me that you don't think that the same level of skill went into this? I mean, I was goading for sacrilege here. Like, you mean the same level of skill didn't exist in the late 50s? No, it absolutely did not. That's not what those are. And I was like, yes, you can quote me. I didn't in the video, but.
He's right to a point in some of the fact, especially with the Martin and building an acoustic guitar, it is completely different and it's a lot of variables. So.
Right.
But as far as it's less.
Wait, what's the joke, Dave, about bursts?
Well,
there was only 1792 built, and there's only 3,000 left. Exactly right. Yeah, that's the classic joke, and that joke was around reproductions, and Dave was in the thick of it because his dad was a dealer, and the whole thing about.
I own a bunch of replicas, high-end replicas.
You do.
I mean, I've got a Max Explorer that is 99%
right.
the same as a real one, basically, and
exactly
right. And I said in a video, I was holding it in a video, and I said something about this is Dave's Explorer, and Dave calls me right up. He's like, "People are gonna think I own a real Explorer."
Yeah, no, well, and that's the thing. But I mean,
I didn't know there was 21 of them.
Yeah,
I had no idea.
That's the thing. But here's the thing: even the replicas of that quality, I mean, that's still a 5-figure guitar.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's not, we're not talking like I can get one of those for $5-6 grand. I mean, it's a whole nother level. And there's the guys who buy those are collectors who can't get the real ones.
Right.
They want the next best thing, and that's why they.
Well, and then there's that whole we could do.
Slash alone has half of his.
Does he have any real ones?
No, yeah, he definitely does. But he's definitely got a lot of replicas, and they're amazing replicas.
Yeah. Sure.
And that's why he wants them, because he appreciates how well they are.
Well, and what I was going to say about your Explorer is that once you and I got on the phone, and I said, well, I didn't tell anybody where you live.
Yeah.
Most importantly. But the kicker is you went on to tell me that all the hardware and the PAFs, the actual pickups, came out of a 58,
it's all
355 that was demolished, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that was
the
an
pickups came
accident
out of 345, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's two sides to this discussion, though, because right now we're focusing on sort of the holy grail of the electric guitar market, the Burst, right? And I think there's a couple other guitars that exist in that category, right? So, mid to late 50s Strats, for example, early 60s Strats.
Yeah, small numbers as well.
Blackguard Tellys, no casters, things like that. The early stuff.
Yeah.
And then outside of that, pre-war and war era Martins, maybe some Banner era Gibsons, things like that.
50s Gretches. There's a few others, but yeah.
My hunch is that those guitars will always hold their value because of their significance in not just music history but pop culture history of the 60s and the 70s and the players that played them and the music that was made with them. But outside of that, all of the other vintage guitars like CBS era Fenders, for example, which right now are insanely expensive.
Right.
They're not particularly rare. They're not particularly, well known, with a few exceptions to that. I think those will drop in value.
Okay, so I look at my assistant Billy. Billy's 27 or so. He has one 6-string guitar that he just got recently, but he plays a lot of extended range guitars, which all of his friends are into, and friends of mine like Tosin Abasi play extended range guitars. Those are guitars that are in today. They're not playing Les Paul replicas or anything. They're not playing Les Pauls at all.
Well, they weren't playing Les Paul replicas in the 80s either. Everyone was playing Super Strats with Floyd Roses.
But they don't, and then if the music is not in vogue, the type of music that the heroes, why do people want 59 Les Pauls? Because of the people that played them.
It's like you can't separate the great players from the mythos that is that guitar type. Right. I said in one of my earliest videos, if you're holding a white Stratocaster, Jimi Hendrix is in the room. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you're half a player. But the reality is you can't separate, and that's your argument. You cannot separate those players from the myth of those guitars.
Right.
Yeah, and I would give you that. I would concede that point. Doesn't necessarily mean that the prices are going to drop back down. I actually think you raised a really interesting point about, because I included in my videos, I show what adjusted prices are for inflation. And people love to say, well, this is my inheritance. This is my retirement fund. Oh, really? Do the numbers on that.
Yeah.
Because economically speaking, it doesn't hold up. You're lucky if you go with inflation. The only time you make real money is if it's an artist attached thing.
Right.
That's the only time the numbers outpace inflation.
And there are so few artists that actually, and Dave will attest to this, how many artists really make a difference that they owned it? We can count them on two hands.
Oh yeah, it wouldn't be that many, no.
Right.
Well, and then you have nowadays, things like the Get Back documentary, where you'll have these sort of pop culture things that happen sort of randomly that'll cause a blip in the market, right? When I bought my casino, you couldn't find casinos because Get Back had just come out and everyone wanted a casino.
All ebb and flow with that.
Right. And I think there is part of that. But I just, for the cream of the crop, things that were made in low numbers that have a ton of provenance. They have a ton of provenance around them. I think that stuff will hold its value. Now, as an investment, I think you're right. You're not going to see 10, 12, 15% return per year on that kind of thing.
Sadly, you can still do better in the market.
Yeah. Right. But most people that are buying bursts, early strats, they're not necessarily buying them as investment pieces. They're collectors, and they want them for sentimental reasons or collectability reasons or whatever. But
I mean, if you look at what Bonamassa has done for the vintage market, I mean, I would dare to say he's probably half the reason that the bursts are still where they are. And there's a whole bunch of young players that love him, that follow him, and their whole thing is like, I got to have that guitar. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think it is a generational thing, and it's but there's always the cool factor too. You can't put a dollar factor on the cool factor. It's like, if somebody wants something bad enough because they think it's going to make them that much better because they own it, they're going to buy it. And
to your point, Keith, earlier, people are always going to be listening to Zeppelin. They're always going to listen to the Beatles. They're always going to listen to whoever.
Yeah, but they can buy reissues.
They can buy reissues, but when we were at dinner, I brought up the example. There's a few TikTok accounts I follow that are book collectors, document collectors. You want to talk about a niche thing? Like people that are collecting leafs of the was it the Gutenberg Bible, the first printed document ever? These are things that in the pop culture sphere don't even move the needle at all. In that community, those things still hold massive amounts of value because of the rarity, because of the story behind it, because of the history. And the further you get away in time from when that thing was printed or when that Les Paul was made, it's going to become more rare, more sought after, because
and like anything, condition is everything too. Like, if you're going to buy a vintage piece, I always tell somebody, don't buy anything that's modded or refinished if you can help it, because down the road when you do sell it, it's a no stories guitar. It is what it is. You can't. It's not like, well, this has been changed and this and that. You can just go, this is completely 100% original, and people go, wow,
Yeah, that SG. So, I bought that SG from the second owner, from Lindsay, down at Maple Street Guitars, and Dave went through it.
It's 100% legit, and that's the way you want it. If you or buying a vintage instrument, that's that's what you wanted. You didn't want anything.
This is really your only vintage
that's
instrument.
That's my only vintage instrument. And in the sort of hierarchy of vintage guitars, that's not anywhere
65,
near
correct?
65.
Yeah. So let's drill back down through. What was your motivation, your thinking? You're not in the same generation with us.
No, but that guitar ticks all my boxes. Like there's not a player associated with that guitar for me, right? But it's slab mahogany, Gibson, single P90, all original, super lightweight. I mean, it ticks all the boxes.
Yeah, and the minute you picked it up, you're like, this is it.
Yeah, my wife Tilly, who's holding that camera right now, I sat and played 3 SGs that day, and she said that's the one that's the one you need. You play better on that guitar.
And which is the other hidden aspect of vintage guitars where people go, are they really that much different? If they make you feel like you're playing better, then what is that worth?
Right.
I mean,
well,
and I'm not saying every vintage guitar is amazing, because they're not, but if it does what, that's my critique too. When I go in and buy a vintage, or I'm looking for something, if I pick it up and I go, I know this is it. You just know it. It's just weird how that happens.
I have played a handful of bursts, and I'd say I think I've played 3 or 4, and only one of them really shook me.
Yeah, spoke to you.
And it was one that I played in a video on my channel. What is the Les Paul sound? The burst sound. The one I played at Carter. That one was, and I remember this feeling that I had holding it. That guitar wasn't famous. It wasn't owned by by anybody famous.
It was a nice top, though.
It was a nice top, 59 burst. But I remember holding that guitar, and the way I felt playing it was there was this sort of weight to the how do I describe it? With it being its age and being a real burst, it changed my relationship with how I was playing it. Now, that doesn't happen with all vintage guitars. Right. In fact, a lot of vintage guitars are dogs.
Like I said, they're not always great.
There's a reason they're still around. Because they didn't get played because they weren't great guitars. Right. The reason I asked you to drill down your own thought process with this guitar is that actually you didn't include any of the things that we're concerned about lowering value in the long run.
Right.
And I knew that from your video.
Yeah.
That this guitar just spoke to you. And I will say, there is no more Honduran mahogany like this.
Mm-hmm.
No.
So there might be again someday, but not for 150 years.
Right.
There's not going to be wood like the wood that's in this guitar.
Okay, so Dave, correct me if I'm wrong though. The further we get away from 1959 or whatever, 58, the harder it is to authenticate instruments.
I would say recently, yes, and that's where
and the counterfeits
who you're buying
are so
it from,
good.
and I mean there are some phenomenal forgeries.
Right.
Me.
So doesn't that in some way affect if the things are worth anything or not, or how much?
It helps the real ones.
It helps the real ones because it proves that they're worth being copied at that level.
Yeah.
And you're talking about 5-digit guitars.
Yeah, and I mean,
copies.
I look at the replicas I'm talking about are not just the you walk into Guitar Center and buy a reissue. These are another level of, I look at them as artwork, honestly, because they're the guys who are putting these guitars together are using the same woods, and they're using the same exact techniques to build it down to the glue, down to everything. Right. And so that to me, that is a whole nother level artistry, because they're trying to make it as good as the original.
And that's going to get harder and harder.
And that there's I can name 3 people on this earth that I consider in that realm. Yep. So it's
okay. So if you were to say, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, who are the people whose guitars are really worth a lot of money from their name? Jimmy Page,
David Gilmour,
right? David Gilmour,
Larry Carlton,
Joe Pass.
Yeah.
So this came up.
The Beatles.
We have to cover this. So during the evening today, Rick got all excited, and it's amazing that this is not Googleable. That's a thing, right?
Yeah.
My dad loved Joe Pass.
There we go.
And I love Joe Pass. My dad's favorite musician was Joe Pass. And I said to Dave or Keith, I was like, where's that guitar?
What guitar did he play that on?
What guitar did he play on Virtuoso,
Yeah.
which came out in 1973, and they say D'Angelico. Where is that guitar now? Who has that guitar? Does it exist? It has to exist somewhere.
We tried to Google it, and it did not come up right away. So the whole group is working on this now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I think it's in
where are
Dubai
they?
somewhere.
But does a guitar that's owned by Joe Pass really increase the value though?
Oh, that's a very small list. That's where you were going.
I was just going to say that's a very small list.
Very, very small.
But to the guys who would collect high-end jazz box guitars, I mean that would be the equivalent of having Hendrix's Strat.
Sure.
One of his Strats.
Well, and I started making a series of videos called "The Guitars of," and I've talked to all of you guys about who's on this list.
Yeah.
It doesn't fill 2 hands.
Right.
Yeah.
You can't make a video that enough people will recognize as a guitar hero. And then, me, I'm always very interested in the backstories of the guitars themselves. So that's a very small list of people. And it's only those people whose guitars would then demand top dollar.
Well, and then you look at someone like Brian May. Brian May has one guitar, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and like that, see, to me, that guitar would be in a class by itself because there is no other one.
There is no other one.
So that's almost like a Smithsonian kind of piece where it's priceless and you just,
It's priceless.
Well, a lot of these originals, I think, are Smithsonian pieces.
Jimmy Page's.
Yeah.
Well, even things like, at Songbirds Museum a few years ago, they had a Women of Rock and Roll exhibit. And they had Elizabeth Cotton's Martin. They had one of Carol Kay's basses.
Yeah.
Right.
And I remember having a discussion because we had played a show there, and we got in the van after the show, and me and the guys in the band were having this sort of just almost moral discussion of those guitars I don't think should be in a private collection. Those guitars deserve to be in a public museum like the Smithsonian because they've had such a massive impact on pop culture and sort of the course of our nation's history.
Right.
That anyone should be able to go and see that and learn the story of those instruments, and more importantly, the story of the people that played those instruments and made the music that shifted the course. I mean, especially if we're talking about music in the 60s and the Vietnam War and the protest era. I mean, these instruments had a massive impact on world events.
And the cool thing about Songbirds is that they have musicians in to play them.
Yeah.
That's a very, very cool thing about the mission of Songbirds. They have this huge educational thing. They have this whole instrument branch where they're raising money for that. That's an amazing organization. And I'm thrilled. I've heard they're open again.
They've opened again, which is good.
It's fantastic.
If you're in Chattanooga, Tennessee,
absolutely
stop by Songbirds. It's worth the time.
But I think your point's really interesting that is a very short list, but it's a deeply influential list. So the reason that
it's influential to people that are of that generation. It remains to be seen what groups are famous.
Well, actually,
making that prediction.
We can nerd out a little in a YouTube kind of way. You and I both know the analytics of my channel. So people that want to know the stories of these, lauded guitars, I think when I built the channel, the assumption was that it's going to be guys my age, watching these videos. It's not.
It's not.
My channel is the same number. I have the same number of people at 25 years old that I have at 55 and 65 years old. Yeah. And so to me, that's actually an interesting statistic around what values might hold on to, or how people see the value of them, whether they're actually in the game of being able to afford those guitars is a completely other thing. They might be wishing for an R9.
I just don't hear young people, and I know a lot of young guitar players, other than Rhett, that are talking about these vintage guitars. They all play new guitars. They do.
Well, it's because none of us can afford them. I mean, this gets into the sort of generational.
But they don't even talk about it though. They don't. I wish I could have a 59 burst.
The way the market is at this moment, it's so who's got $500,000 to drop on a guitar? It's not
right. Because once you get beyond the Murphy lab, then the next step is
Yeah, but those guitars are excellent guitars, and if you can afford those guitars, people will buy them. That's why I don't think that those guitars eventually will lose their value. I don't know. I think that there's just so much inventory out there now of these.
See, I think it's the opposite. Because, like what you were saying, so the fact that Gibson has invested so much money into things like Murphy Lab, right? Mm-hmm. Getting you as close as humanly possible to the real thing while spending, less than a tenth of the price, and people are buying them. I mean, they're flying off the shelves because they can afford them, and that is raising the profile of the real ones. It's
done this.
Yeah,
right? It's pushing it up like that. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. But the gap is still big. It's a huge gap.
When you have the new reissue, you're really what you want is the original. That's what you want. I mean, that's what you like. Because no matter how good,
I don't know. I don't want the original. I don't.
You know what? I think a good example is Red Eye. So Ed King's burst from Skinner that now Jason Isbell owns, and the story of that transaction has been well documented. And people like me, I'm a massive Jason Isbell fan. So for me, Jason is now a part of Red Eye's history.
Yeah, he's a boss guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
And Gibson Custom Shop built him a clone to take out on the road and everything. But I'm 32 years old. I was born in 1990. I'm one of these people. I was not around when Zeppelin was cutting records and putting out stuff. I don't remember when, Hey Jude came out. My parents were in middle school and high school, and that stuff and they weren't even listening to that stuff. My parents were listening to funk and R&B and soul music from the time. But I found that music in the early to mid 2000s on my own, before YouTube, before social media, really. I found that music and it connected with me in a way that was completely organic, and that is my sound. As a guitar player, that is my voice. Those are the people I look up to. And I think that will continue to happen for future generations.
It's interesting. This conversation is actually, I'm sitting here realizing it's almost a conversation of, are you typical? Is Rhett's 32 years old?
You're not typical.
Right.
Yeah. But the thing is,
how
man,
atypical is he? That's the real question.
Extremely atypical.
There's a lot of people, though.
Are we still talking about the guitar thing?
Yeah. I mean, I'm weird. I'm not going to deny that. But there's a lot of people like me. There's a lot of young people like me that like the stuff that we look up to these bands, we look up to these artists, and I think we always will, because the art that they made was so good that it will stand the test of time. I mean, that's really what we're talking
That's the
about.
part.
Yeah,
That's
so
not
I don't disagree with any of this,
Right.
and I own plenty of vintage equipment, right?
Yeah.
But all my stuff is player grade.
Yeah.
From the amplifiers, everything, it's all
The guitars, yeah.
the
Yeah.
guitars.
Yep.
I don't care about,
Right.
if it needs a refret, Dave's going to refret it.
Yeah.
The stuff has to play, because ultimately these are just tools.
Right. Well, that's a different discussion. The difference between a collector and a player.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm the same way.
I just say, I'll go back to the thing. You put this stuff up on Reverb and see what it's worth. You put a 59 Les Paul up there, put a burst up there.
People do.
People do.
People do.
Right? And how much money do they get for them? Do they get?
I mean,
It varies on the guitar, and it also especially with a burst, it's all about the top.
Right.
If you want the
It
big
really
money,
is.
it
It's
better
all
be
about
just
the top.
crazy.
Yeah.
Which most of them weren't. So most of them were at best maybe medium flamed
Right.
at best.
Right.
And so you're thinking, with like 17, 18 guitars, you might have maybe 600-700 that were out, really nice or considered outstanding. The best ones, there's a handful. And they're already spoken for, and they've been in collections forever, and they get traded between collectors because those guitars actually have names and they know who owned them, and the tops are insane, and so.
Well, I thought it was really funny. You were talking about, you had a guitar that was put back to a gold top.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it was a
Yeah, it was an offset 52 that somebody had stripped and
the top was nice, but it was offset.
yeah, it was flamed, but it was offset. And of course, Keith told me, he said, "Well, I should have painted it red to make it look like Harrison." And I was like, "Yeah."
Like
So
Lucy.
I took it back to a gold top. I had it restored to a gold top.
Yeah.
A friend of mine did it, and it's funny because that guitar, I had that guitar when I was 12 years old. I bought that at a show with my dad in '83 or '84.
Wow.
And, it was a player grade guitar then, and I couldn't afford a 58, 59 Les Paul. My dad, we had two of them in the 70s, and we had sold both of them. And even in the 70s, those guitars were hard to find. It wasn't even like,
Right,
it wasn't like you just opened up a paper, oh, there's a 59 burst.
Yeah.
It's like, man, you had to beat the bushes to find a
Well, and it's
burst.
like the story that Rhett told where he's played 4 up at Carter's over time.
Yeah.
And only one was the combination of a nice top.
Right.
That's a really nice top. But then that's attached to a really amazing piece of mahogany, because that's really where most of the resonance is
Right.
coming from, is
Sure.
that mahogany neck, and then, as we all know, they were all handmade guitars. So everyone was different. Every neck was different.
Yeah.
They're all different.
But see, I'm I guess atypical in that I could care less about the top. In fact, with maple guitars, I don't like flamey maple guitars at all. I want the
I don't either.
I want the most
You two
plain.
should sit over here and we can sit
Yeah.
over there.
I mean, I can go either way with it, but it's, sonically there's no
Yeah, but
difference.
that's the thing to me is like I could have cared less what that guitar looked like. It could have been painted,
right.
safety cone yellow for all I cared. It sounded and played unbelievably well, and it did. It was like the purest. The best way I could describe it is like the purest form of Les Paul that I've ever played.
You've ever had a chance.
It's like that. Okay, that's now the yardstick to judge every other Les Paul by, is that one that I played at Carter.
Yeah. And I would go so far as to say that every guitar, whether it's a vintage guitar or not, we talked about this the other day, I don't hit the guitar very hard. You hit it much harder than I do. You hit it even harder yet.
Yeah.
So the 3 guitars that would be perfect for each of the guitars that would be perfect for each of us are 3 very different guitars.
Yeah,
Right.
definitely. Yeah.
So that's another whole thing. It's not just that this is an exceptional Les Paul. It was a really great Les Paul for the way you play.
Right.
And that's another whole thing.
I think in the future there will be enough people around who are into these things that it will keep the values up.
I'm in agreement. If as long as the music's around that was around when they were hot, they will never die. Now we talked about the player grade. The player grade stuff will be in major flux, because at that point, buy a reissue because it's just about the same thing, you know. So, but the super clean high end stuff, those will always bring money. They've never failed yet, honestly. And I've seen it in the last 40 years. I mean, I remember when bursts were $3,000. So, and that was a lot of money. That was
you should have bought them.
Oh, we did.
Well, and
I sold them.
right. In the recent Van Halen video, I tell the story where he said he bought 2 from Norm, 259s, and he was embarrassed to say he spent $10,000.
Yeah.
Well, hold on. Someone in the comments can do the math. So what year would that have been? 80.
That was 1980.
80. Yeah, 1980.
All right. So whatever $10,000 was in 1980.
We'll get back to everybody with that.
Yeah, they're about $5,000
in the
a
description.
piece.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious to see what people think.
Yeah.
That's right.
If these values will.
Well, at the end of the day, no matter how great a guitar you have, it's not going to make you a better player physically, but it might help you mentally. But that's really where it's at, though.
There you go.
So.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, play whatever makes you happy.
But
there you go.
But my signature guitar, you probably should check
Yeah,
out. when it comes out.
Rick's signature is clinically proven to make you a better guitar player.
And it will definitely resist all market fluctuation.
Yeah. And if it doesn't,
It's a sound investment.
And if it doesn't, call him later and say, hey,
Don't call Rick, because we started this on the darkest possible note. When Keith and Rick are gone, will these guitars be worth anything?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, really nice. Yeah. Well, that's a wrap.
Well, thank you guys for hanging out.
Thanks for
Thanks for
in the
dinner.
studio
Thanks for
here.
dinner.
Yeah.
Tilly,
And,
Thank you, Tilly.
Yeah, thank you, Tilly, for filming. Thank you,
Yes.
Penny, for being such a great,
such a good
girl.
stealing my mic.
Go subscribe to 5 Watt World. Let's get him over 200,000.
Yeah,
tonight. Right.
Yeah.
Rick is fine. He's got enough subscribers.
good.
Follow
Dave on Instagram.
follow Dave on Instagram, Dojo Guitar Repair, and subscribe here if you haven't already. Thank you guys so much for watching, and let's do this again.
Cool.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.